For more, I'm joined by Brian Brenberg, chair of the program in business and finance at King's College in Manhattan, and Tina Fordham, partner and head of global political strategy at Avonhurst and former city chief global political analyst. It's good to see both of you today. Tina, it's not just agricultural purchases here. It's also that China has made huge commitments in terms of oil, and we have already seen demand slumping. Is there any chance that it can keep up with those commitments in the mid of this massive outbreak of coronavirus?
I think we have to be prepared for a slowdown, as we heard from Secretary MNUCHIN, in how this deal is implemented. And I think from my perspective as a political risk analyst, the extent to which the coronavirus was not something that was in anybody's 2020 year ahead forecasts, and is now has the potential to be a significant negative trigger both for supply chains and the global economy, should really tell us a lot about the way that we think about risk.
Coronavirus has really pushed this trade deal off of the front pages now, Brian. Give me a sense of how you put phase one into perspective going into effect today and how it plays out pushing for a phase two.
Yeah, I mean, coronavirus, I think, really takes a lot of the impetus off trying to get to phase two. There's a lot that has to happen with phase one. I mean, we're just sort of finishing the deal, putting it into effect now, but we're not talking about implementation. We're not talking about China is keeping up its end of the bargain. It's not just purchases, remember. It's also intellectual property. It's also forced technology transfer. I think the U.S. government wants to see if, in fact, China is making progress there. So I think we're hearing a lot of rhetoric that suggests phase two could be rolled out in different tranches, that we're not in a huge hurry. The president has said that. MNUCHIN has alluded that there's not a huge hurry here. I don't expect phase two this year, or at least a totality of phase two, given that from an economic and political standpoint, there is just not a lot of pressure to get it done.
We're seeing some, as we see the caucuses and the primaries play out, I mean, you have now Bernie Sanders winning New Hampshire. How do you factor in what it means if Bernie Sanders continues with some momentum? He's as anti-free trade as the president has been, Tina.
Well, I actually think that the question that will be at the front of investors' minds is whether the beginning of a U.S. economic slowdown really hurts President Trump's chances for a second term. Certainly, there have been longstanding worries about a hard-left Democratic nominee, and even suggestions from some of the investors on Wall Street that I talked to that a nomination of Bernie or Elizabeth Warren could in itself be a trigger for a slowdown. But that was pre-coronavirus. So my answer, based on looking at previous pre-election periods like this, is that for the slowdown to hurt President Trump significantly, it would have to start very soon and be very sharp. On the flip side, does that boost the chances of a Warren or a Sanders? I don't think so, actually. I still think that the momentum is actually for President Trump.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, a sharp slowdown might boost a Democrat candidate's chances. And yet what we've seen, and I've been on the ground, you go out and you talk to farmers who are losing their farms because of tariffs. And it was not enough to change their support for President Trump.
And they still support Trump, don't they? Yes.
Yeah.
But that speaks more to polarization and how you're not going to get people crossing the aisle over a 1 or 2 point growth slowdown.
Can you use conventional wisdom and tradition when gaming out what happens with politics and the way it might affect the markets and investments?
Well, let me just jump in, because I think, farmers have to some degree dealt with some real challenges with tariffs. But on the other hand, in this battle with China over trade, I think a lot of people, even who might be hurt by it in some ways, still recognize that there are real issues at play. We are talking about American property, and particularly intellectual property, which is the backbone of this economy. We're talking about a government that just does not play by the rules in most people's perspective. And so I think the president has bought a lot of goodwill there. And he's bought a lot of goodwill because the economy, even though we're talking here about slowdown, it has been incredibly strong from a labor market perspective, from a wage perspective. It's the best we've seen in a decade. And so I think a lot of people are still giving the president a lot of goodwill and a lot of credit for what he's done and the trends we've been seeing going into 2020.
You know, Brian, is there a chance that coronavirus does what even the trade war wasn't doing in terms of convincing manufacturers to move their supplies and their supply chains out of China?
I think this is a real issue. You know, Wilbur Ross alluded to it, I think it was last week, and he got some heat for focusing too much on economics. But the truth is he's making a good point. We're having this decoupling conversation when it comes to U.S. business supply chains and China. And this is one more reason why I think American companies are going to look at China and say, what is my real total risk here? It's not just political risk, or it's political risk that can bleed into issues like health. And I think if you're an American company, you say, wait a second, is there something I can be doing here in the U.S. that eliminates that risk and still allows me to serve my customers? This is a real issue, and I do think coronavirus is going to play into it.
All right. And Tina, just finally, are there any other big risks looming for you other than coronavirus?
Well, coronavirus is clearly a black swan, and just building on what Brian has said, I think it's actually a massive test for the Chinese leadership. That hasn't come up in our conversations, especially coming on the back of Hong Kong protests, right? So the Chinese leadership's ability not just to maintain control and prevent the spread, but actually to keep the confidence of the people is very much at stake here. In terms of other black swans, I think blowback from the assassination earlier this year over the Iranian military figure is still something to contend with, and reigniting those tensions. I'm also concerned about an uptick in refugee flows coming out of Syria via Turkey if Turkey decides to open those gates again. And remember, that triggered a lot of political instability here in Europe.